I'm Tom Dusteberg. I'm the director of the Manufacturing and Society program here at the Aspen Institute. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you here today. I'm going to be brief. We have an exciting panel, a very knowledgeable panel, and I want to give them all the time that they need to have a thorough discussion of the issue of the day, which is whether or not we ought to start exporting oil, crude oil. I want to thank my co-sponsors, the Maypi Foundation, who joined with me on the paper that we're releasing today, and also the co-author of the paper, Jeff Whirling at Inforum, who did the analytic modeling that is behind the analysis in the paper. So we're going to start today by giving you a brief overview of the paper that we are releasing. And to present this, my co-author from the Maypi Foundation, Don Norman. Don is the Director of Economic Studies at the Maypi Foundation. He also runs the Educational Council for Maypi for CFOs and financial executives. He also compiles Maypi's widely recognized research piece, the quarterly Maypi Business Outlook, which has an excellent track record of being a predictor of manufacturing activity in the United States. Don has had a good career here in Washington. He started out teaching in California, has a PhD in economics from UCLA, worked at the Federal Trade Commission and at the American Petroleum Institute. And then for the last 15 years or so, he's been with Manufacturers Alliance. So, Don, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Try and be brief here. Crude oil exports were banned in 1973 in the era of the Arab oil embargo. And still, with falling production and consumption, imports grew steadily, and by 2008 accounted for 2/3 of total U.S. petroleum consumption. And then something happened. After years of research and testing, hydraulic fracturing, coupled with directional drilling, enabled producers to extract natural gas and crude oil from shale formations. Oil and gas production is now a high-tech manufacturing process. It's not the hit-or-miss activity engaged in by James Dean in the movie Giant. The turnaround in U.S. oil and gas production surprised everyone. In the case of oil production this past July, we find that production was 3.5 million barrels a day greater than it was in January of 2008. And what this means is that U.S. production has offset unplanned supply disruptions in countries like Libya, Nigeria, and Iran. And had this increase in production not occurred, had we continued on a steady downward path in terms of oil production, the price of oil today would be higher, considerably higher than its current level. Now, most of the oil that is coming from shale formations is what is called light oil. And what this means is that it can't be processed in the same way as heavier oils. Refiners have invested some $85 billion in recent years to configure refineries so that they can process heavier oil, heavier slates of crude oil. Like everyone else, they did not anticipate this ocean of light oil coming on. They can process light oil, but the efficiency with which they can do so, with which they can turn out various petroleum products, is less than what the refineries are configured for. And given that they can buy heavier crude oil on the market at a lower price, light oil has to sell at a discount if it is to be competitive. Now, production of light oil is expected to keep growing, and because it sells at a discount, the incentive to fully develop our resources is reduced. The solution is simple. allow producers to export oil. They can sell light oil on the world market where it commands a premium, mainly in places like Europe. Our projections of the impacts of lifting the ban on exports were developed using Inforum's long-term inter-industry forecasting tool, or LIFT. Benefits to the overall economy were estimated, but our focus was on what happens in the manufacturing sector. Now, we looked at two scenarios, a low export case and a high export case, and the impact on production in these two scenarios is shown in this chart. Oil production in the high export scenario is up an average of 2 million barrels a day throughout the period from 2016 through 2025, and actually by 2025 rises to 3.25 million barrels of oil per day. Now, these projections are not a pipe dream. The technology for extracting oil from shale formations is expected to keep on improving. This, along with growing estimates of our shale resource base, makes such projections realistic. And it's worth noting that the EIA in recent years has steadily increased its long-term projection of U.S. oil production, and I fully expect that when the next annual energy outlook comes out, that they will do so again. The prices of petroleum products, like gasoline, are closely linked to the world price of oil. Now, despite the fact that the U.S. has become a major exporter of petroleum products in recent years, note that petroleum product exports are not banned. Despite these dramatic rise in petroleum product exports, prices of petroleum products still remain closely track the world price of oil. And the increase in production that would be occasioned by lifting the ban on exports would, because it would lead to additional production, would actually put additional downward pressure on the world price of oil relative to where it would otherwise be. And as a result, we expect that there'd actually be some modest downward pressure on prices of petroleum products, including gasoline, which could fall modestly, but still fall by perhaps 8 to 9 cents a gallon. Now, a key point that we emphasize in this paper is that additional development of oil reserves leads to an increase in the demand for a host of manufactured products, including steel, pipe, hydraulic pumps, valves, heavy earth-moving equipment, and this really is how it is that the manufacturing sector gets a benefit from this. Now, some of the impacts on production and investment in our high export scenario are shown in this chart here. Production in the durable goods sector, and this includes machinery and materials, increased by 1.4%, or by $8 billion in 2017. Agriculture, mining, and construction equipment production would increase by 6% in 2017, and capital investment for machinery would be $7 billion above its base case level by 2020. Lifting the ban on oil exports will not, by itself, lead to a manufacturing renaissance, but it would generate real and measurable benefits to the manufacturing sector and, by extension, to the overall economy. Now, shown in this chart, lifting the ban would also create additional jobs in manufacturing, construction, and related professional services. For example, from the period from 2016 to 25, again, that's the period we looked at, manufacturing in the high export scenario would gain an average of 37,000 jobs per year. Mining would gain 43,000 jobs per year. And construction employment would jump by 216,000 by 2017. In brief, really, as Lawrence Summers observed, the merits of lifting the ban on crude oil exports really are as clear with respect to any significant policy he has ever encountered. With that, I'll turn it back over to Tom.
Thanks, Don, and I would invite our panel to be seated up front. You all have a copy of the hard copy of the paper that Don described. It's available online now. I'd like to quickly introduce our distinguished panel. Our moderator today is Nelson Schwartz from the New York Times. He's covered the economy and economics for the business section of the Times since 2012. His articles have included a look at Social Security taxes as they affect low-income workers. And he specializes in looking at the impacts of changes in the economy on the human level. He's had a distinguished career in journalism, working for Fortune and the Baltimore Sun, Smart Money magazine. Nelson's a graduate of the University of Chicago, where he studied Russian and American history. Our panelists in alphabetical order are C. Boyden Gray, the founding partner of Boyden Gray and Associates, a law and regulatory strategy firm in D.C. Boyden's had an incredibly diverse and distinguished career here in Washington. He served as White House counsel to President George H.W. Bush, in which capacity he assisted the president's enactment of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, development of the cap-and-trade system for acid rain emissions, and enactment of the Energy Policy Act of 1992. He served as President George W. Bush's ambassador to the European Union and as special envoy for Eurasian energy diplomacy and special envoy for European Union affairs. Our second panelist is Randy Hogan. Randy's the longtime chief executive officer and chairman of Pentair, which he joined in 1998. In his previous careers included president of the United Technologies Carrier Transicol division. He was also with Pratt & Whitney, General Electric, and McKinsey. Randy's also the chair of the board of directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, which he pointed out to me includes North Dakota and the Bakken Formation and everything that's going on there. Finally, I would note that today the Harvard Business Review released its 2014 list of the 100 best performing CEOs in the world, and Randy was among them, clocking in at number 68. It's given to those who, quote, actually delivered solid results over the long run. So congratulations to Randy for that recognition. Third panelist is Scott Sheffield. He's held the position of CEO of Pioneer Natural Resources since 1997 and has been chairman of the board since 1999. He's a distinguished graduate of the University of Texas with a BS degree in petroleum engineer, and his entire career has been spent in the oil and gas sector. Before joining the first company that he worked for, Parker and Parsley, Mr. Sheffield was employed as a production and reservoir engineer for Amoco. Many of us fondly remember the Amoco name. Finally, our fourth panelist is Jeff Whirling, who is the director of Inforum. He's completed recent studies at Inforum on the economic implications of energy policy, immigration, exchange rate fluctuations, and port disruptions due to terrorist strikes. Inforum is a specialist in long-term forecasting and is especially expert on the industrial sector. Jeff also teaches an undergraduate course in economic development at the University of Maryland. Previously, Jeff and I worked together at the Manufacturers Alliance, and before that, he was at National Electrical Manufacturers Association. Jeff has a PhD in economics from the University of Maryland. So now I would turn it over to Nelson for a good discussion.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Aspen and Mappy, for bringing this together. Why don't we start off with some opening, just maybe a 5-minute opening remarks from our panelists. Why don't we go this way, Scott, if you want to give us your perspective on the issue.
Thanks, Tom, and it's great to be here with this opening paper. I'm going to try to give in 5 minutes what's happened, what's transpired, and why the export ban lifting is important for our industry. But as you know, the industry focused on gas shales first, starting back about 10 years ago, and ended up bringing forward the Marcellus, the Barnett, the Haynesville, the Woodford, because we all thought that gas would flow much easier through this very, very dense source rock. We found a 150-year supply, maybe 200-year supply of natural gas for this country, which itself has led to a revolution. And with that collapse, we began focusing on oil shales. Most of us thought we weren't sure how the oil shales, the source rocks, would react to these 35, 40-stage hydraulic stimulation frac jobs. And so, example, we're the largest player in the Permian Basin, most active company, which is really the 1,000-pound gorilla for oil growth for the next 30, 40, 50 years in this country. Way above the Bakken and the Eagle Ford, primarily because we have 12 zones or 4,000 feet of stacked source rocks on top of each other. Where the Eagle Ford has one zone, the Bakken has 2 zones. But the Permian Basin has probably 10 to 12 zones. So we're going after the first 2 zones, the most prolific. And instead of making wells that come on 50 barrels a day through vertical drilling, which we've had over the last 30, 40, 50 years, we're making wells that come on 2,000, 3,000 barrels a day, going after the source rock, which is 2 miles below the surface and especially the fresh water table. What's happened over the last 3 years with this growth, we've gone from 5 million barrels a day up to 8.8 million barrels of oil per day. We're growing at a rate of over 1 million barrels of oil per day per year. And so about 3 years ago, we saw historically WTI, West Texas Intermediate sweet crude, which you heard earlier that most of this crude that's coming on is sweet crude. And Brent, it's got a relationship with Brent North Sea crude. Historically, it's been around $2. About 3 years ago, because of issues in Cushing, it blew out to about $27. So we were getting $27 less than the world price. Those have been solved for the time being. West Texas, the crude there has been as high as $17, $18. There's issues there. But our biggest issue is the fact that we're moving all this light sweet crude to a refining complex that was built to handle heavy crude. $85 billion was invested over the last 10 to 15 years to handle Canadian oil sands, Mexican crude, and Venezuelan crude, and Saudi medium crude. And so we're flooding it with sweet crude. We've been getting historically a very huge discount. As you know, oil is the only hydrocarbon that we cannot export. Every other hydrocarbon will be exporting or have been exporting. Most people don't know we've been shipping out almost 4 million barrels a day of products. And so what our concern is to be on a competitive environment with the rest of the world. The futures market has a differential today of about $11 between WTI and Brent. And what we're concerned about is exceeding our refining complex. It's running at 92% capacity already, which is about as high as it can operate. The unknown is what is Saudi going to do. Saudi's been sending 1.5 million barrels a day into that refining complex. They're back down to 1 million recently. But what is Saudi going to do? Canada can only export to one country in the world today. They have been. That's to the U.S. They're up to over 3 million barrels a day going into the Gulf Coast system. Canada's not going to back out. So we have all this record production, and we're concerned about what will happen to the differential. And so that's why we think the export ban should be lifted. It'll allow us to continue to grow on up to 14, 15, 16 million barrels a day. I've seen most high cases by most companies, EIA, other reports. I think it'll be much higher than that because of the potential primarily due to the Permian Basin. So we've created over 1 million jobs. It's been estimated by HS Sarah over another 1 million jobs will be created if we lift the export ban. Significant value to federal coffers, state coffers, over $1 trillion. So obviously from an energy security standpoint, from a trade deficit, we've improved it significantly, reduced it over $200 billion. So I just think it's critical for our industry and for the United States to allow us to be fair in regard to world prices. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Boyd?
Well, I'm going to focus on the potential consumers of these potential exports as a result of my experience in Europe for 3 years. To sort of put this in something of an international context, I want to say by way of introduction that I was a special envoy to the European Union for Eurasian energy. The idea was to help them complete what's known as the Southern Corridor, which would encourage gas to come in from the Caspian through Turkey into Eastern Europe to take the pressure on Eastern Europe by Russia away, and to otherwise reduce Russia's leverage over Europe. I was a spectacular failure at this, I must admit. But there was one good thing that came out of it. On my last night in Europe, I was invited to have dinner at the residence of the commanding general of the European Defense Force. Now you may wonder, well, where is the European Defense Force? Something I wanted to. It was my last night. I was packing. I couldn't really go to the dinner, but I was sent as an extra inducement a list of the invitees, and I was identified as Seaboard and Gray U.S. Special Convoy. So I felt very. I'm completely in favor of open exports. It's an incredible anomaly that you can send refined product, you can send condensate, you can send natural gas, you can send everything but crude itself. That's kind of nutty. It's hard to reconcile with the WTO, where we are complaining mightily that the Chinese are withholding, controlling export of rare earths. How can we sit there and control export of crude? As I understand it, because I want to make this point, if it's valid, because of the backup and the configuration of our Gulf oil refineries, Bakken light crude sells at a discount. But on the world market, because it's so clean, it sells at a premium.
Exactly, it would.
And that's really nutty. So it should be changed. It could be changed. The president can do this. I mean, I could go through the law because I am a lawyer, and it can get fairly complicated, but the president can do this. He doesn't need Congress approval. Congress, I suppose, could block him, but that, I think, would not happen. So the president can do this tomorrow. It is also true that if we sign up a free trade agreement with Europe under a negotiation now as TTIP, how many of you are familiar with TTIP? It's the EU-US free trade agreement. Crude could be shipped, and so could gas without some of the regular hurdles, without hesitation. I think that's what the Europeans would like to see. I think that's what most Americans would like to see, but the TTIP negotiations are very complex and are being hung up at the moment, and will they ever see the light of day? The president could take care of this in 24 hours, whereas it may take 24 months to do TTIP. Now, does this really help Europe, though? Europe's not in need of oil. Oil is a world commodity. They can get that. They can get that fairly transparently without worrying about corruption, paying people off. It's a world commodity. Gas is not quite at that status yet. Maybe 10 years from now, enough pipelines will have been built, enough LNG facilities will have been built, enough big tankers will have been built. But at the moment, it's a little more opaque, especially in the Ukraine, and there's a lot of corruption and a lot of difficulty in moving gas around. One of the benefits of opening up oil exports is that you would have discovered, along with the oil, a huge amount of associated gas, which really could help Europe. At the moment, there isn't the capacity to transform or transport that gas to the East Coast for re-export. Were the facilities there right now to handle it, which they're not. So that's a problem. The amount of flaring that goes on in the Bakken, I'm told, is enormous. The same is also true, shouldn't surprise you, in Russia, because Gazprom still holds the export monopoly over exports of gas. There's an enormous amount of gas that's produced not just by Gazprom, but by both Russia and non-Russian producers alike that can't get access to Gazprom's pipeline and therefore can't export their gas. So there is a huge amount of flaring going on in Russia. And this waste of gas is, to me, really immoral. I mean, it's really, what's your view on climate change? This is very bad for climate change. It's very bad for waste. But it happens, and it's all wound up with the restrictions on the free market. What can Europe do, though, in the interim? I'm not sure that opening up more gas exports to Europe or more oil exports is actually going to solve in the short term, in the short to intermediate term, the problems the Europeans have. There are experts here far more knowledgeable about pricing than I am, but I worry that the price differential is much greater with the Pacific than it is with Europe, and that any excess gas that can be exported will be outbid by Asian buyers, and it's not going to go to Europe. What I think Europe needs to do is to develop its own capacity for production. It may not have quite the same fracking opportunities that we have, but Poland's got a lot of potential. England's got a lot of potential. It shouldn't be banned, as the French have done, to protect their nuclear industry. It shouldn't be banned, as has happened, I think, in Romania and Bulgaria, which is a Russian lobbying tactic. Then I think I believe that Europe should try to open up Gazprom's transportation monopoly the way they've asked of their own utilities inside Europe, and what they asked of Microsoft and succeeded in getting from Microsoft. And now they are looking sort of askance at Google for the same kind of relief. And if they were to do that, a little self-help, I think the Europeans would find more oil available, more gas available, than if they're waiting for the miracle of U.S. exports.
Thank you. Randy?
Well, I'm a manufacturer, so I'm going to talk about jobs. Pentair, we transformed the company to focus on the nexus of food, energy, and water, because that's demand for all of those is going to double and triple over the next 25 years because of the rising middle class. And we have 30,000 employees, with 9,000 of those manufacturing employees in the United States, and that's actually up 16% in the U.S. since 2008. Now, 5% of it is additions. The rest of the 16% is because of consolidations of businesses that we bought and took over. You know, and those jobs, on average, make about $30 an hour, those manufacturing jobs. And that's up 5.8% over the last 2 years. So, and I share that with you because isn't that the kind of jobs that we want in America? These are middle-class, blue-collar, semi-skilled to skilled jobs that are going to be here for a long time. Manufacturing hasn't been a big subject in Washington for, well, my whole career. But that's why I came, so I can talk a little bit about it. And what's driving the growth in those jobs? It's really, a lot of it is energy. About a third of our sales goes into serving energy. We are the largest maker of valves and controls that go to the oil and gas industry and the process industry. So valves that go into collection systems, pipelines, refineries, petrochemical plants, those are our valves. Liquefied natural gas liquefaction plants, those are our valves. We're the biggest maker of thermal management, process thermal management. So when they build a gas liquids plant in the Bakken and they need to heat those pipes to keep them from freezing, that's our technology. We also make filters. We make filters from everything from the filter coffee, where you'd be more familiar with it, to actually separating oil and water in a refinery. All of those businesses have seen growth because of the miracle that Scott talked about. This was not a miracle wrought here in Washington. It was a miracle wrought by the entrepreneurs of the oil and gas industry. You've seen the numbers and the model. As an old modeler, I always find the numbers interesting. But the stories are even more interesting. Right now, there's $50 billion being planned in the petrochemical industry to be spent in the United States. This is an industry that left because they couldn't count on natural gas, which is the feedstock for petrochemicals. They couldn't count on a reliable source at a reliable price. Because of the miracle that Scott talked about, they can now. $50 billion, 3 ethylene crackers. These are extraordinarily good jobs to build the plants, extraordinarily good jobs to operate them. This is the middle class that we're all worried about. These jobs are here, they're being built now. Now, those projects aren't going as fast because there's still too much uncertainty around energy policy and around the economy in general. But they're projects that aren't getting canceled. They're still coming. $50 billion. I like that. That's a lot of my kind of product. And I'll need even to hire more people to serve those jobs. That's one. Another knock-on effect is, as has been mentioned by Boyd and Scott, we can export natural gas. And I think we're going to. Right now there's been FERC has approved 3 liquefaction plants. That's to liquefy the natural gas and ship them out. These are all on the Gulf Coast. These 3. There's 17 more in front of them at various stages of approval. There's another 24 liquefaction plants on the drawing boards. And when I say drawing boards, we're giving estimate quotes so they can work up the economics before it goes in to get approved by FERC. Though they're being placed everywhere from British Columbia around the coast, mostly in the Gulf, but basically in position to be able to sell natural gas everywhere. Now, that will still not hurt our natural gas prices because of the miracle that Scott talked about. And I say miracle, and I use it many times. It's actually a lot of entrepreneurship and a lot of innovation that's gone into being able to drill horizontal wells down 15,000 feet and out 2 miles, and to be able to develop not just the natural gas but now the oil. Now this oil is we're not getting our fair share of the economic value in the United States to that. As you've heard, we sell at a discount. It sells at a discount because it's natural. It can't be sold in its natural market. And as a result, we are flaring gas in the Bakken. It's because we haven't yet been able to afford to build the collection system on the natural gas to be able to capture it and then use it in a productive way. I just finish and tell you that I believe everything about the numbers in terms of the jobs, and if anything, I think it understates the knock-on effect. Because this is a transformative. I've been around the energy industry for 35 years, starting in Venezuela with lifting that heavy oil that they process now in Houston. But having the petrochemical industry come back, have it drive a manufacturing renaissance here in the United States based on secure long-term energy costs, that's the way we're going to get this country moving again. And so lifting the ban on selling that oil into the world market is just a natural thing for us to do. It's the right thing for us to do. And I'll just finish by telling you the story of, those are numbers, but let me tell you about people. I brought the research department of the Fed, the 9th District Fed, out to the Bakken. Because you really don't know something unless you can see it. And there's lots of people that have lots of assumptions about what things look like, whether it's the oil sands or whether it's the Bakken or whether it's the Permian Basin that Scott talked about. And we went out there, and what we saw was, we saw cars from 30 different cities. We saw people at dormitories, men They're talking to their families on Skype back home, and they were smiling, and their kids were smiling. There was money flowing when there was no jobs where those people came from. We saw towns being built. We saw houses being built. We even heard talk of them raising a symphony, because between Minot and Williston, North Dakota, they've only drilled the 5,000 of the 50,000 wells that they intend to drill. They've only drilled one of the 2 formations that they've already identified as being available. They're even going to do a symphony orchestra. I mean, that's long-term planning. This is, if you want to know the American dream, go out there right now and talk to the people right there. It exists. We can build it. People in the city can help build it by removing this. And for those who are concerned about the environment, I'll just leave you with one anecdote. One particular researcher was just stunned when she saw these beautiful fields of sunflowers, a lot of sunflowers in North Dakota. And every once in a while there was a pad cleared for drilling wells. And she was just stunned. She asked me, how can those flowers grow near an oil platform? And I said, once you think about that, and we'll talk about it at lunch.
Great. Thank you, Randy. Jeff, please.
Yep, I thought I would confine my remarks to giving a little more background on the study itself. First of all, our model, which is called the LIFT model, it's been in various stages of development over the last 40 years or so, is what we call an inter-industry macroeconometric model. But what that really means is that we've got an inter-industry or input-output core that's embedded in a macro dynamic model. And the advantage of this structure for a study like this is it does get to the question that Don identified was, many people have talked about the macroeconomic effects of removing the ban, but we wanted to look at the industry effects and most specifically the manufacturing effects. And what we find is, in Table 2, you've got some of the assumptions that went behind this, but the main thing at the initial effect of removing the ban is that you get a big capital expenditure boost, and that's all in exploration, it's in production, it's in transportation as well, so pipelines are going to grow up around this industry. And of course that translates into sales directly to companies like Pentair, people that make drilling pipe. So those are the direct effects. And of course, the model also captures the indirect effects. So the supply chain effects up the, from the steel provider to the people that make coal to make the steel and so on and so forth. We call those the indirect effects. And then finally is what Randy had mentioned, is the induced effects, the fact that people are going to have greater income in their hands then they go out and spend money on restaurants or orchestras and what have you. So you get all those effects captured. Now we do set the context here in the sense that if you look at Table 1, which has the base forecast, we're actually pretty optimistic in that base about where the U.S. economy is going in the next 2 or 3 years. So there's a bit of a snapback. Hopefully that is what actually occurs, but there's still very little inflation in the economy. Interest rates are not very high and so forth. So there's still slack, I guess my point. There's still slack remaining in the economy so that this shock on capital expenditure, if you will, is very, very important in the shorter term. Now, of course, as that capital expenditure kind of levels out, what you are left with is an economy with a higher production level, and specifically of crude oil. So that also has effects, the direct effects of that production, the indirect effects up the supply chain, and the income effects. And that's durable, that's permanent, and that goes out into the long term. So that is basically the economics behind this. Of course, not everyone benefits 100% out of this. One of the things that happens here is a good thing, is that real wages increase a little bit because not only do you have higher employment, you have higher employment in industries that tend to pay higher than the average. So therefore, the real exchange rate does appreciate a bit, which does affect industries as well. So people that are particularly sensitive to real exchange rate increases may lose sales abroad, But the one thing we found in the model is that, at least given the economy as we think it's going to be, those effects are going to be pretty minimal. So the net effect is this large boost. And by the way, you can see those kind of the net effect on industries in figures 7 and 8, which shows you a specific equipment industry and then the overall machinery industry as well, to show you how individual industries might react to this. But again, as people said, the macro effects are pretty clearly, I think, positive on that. But at the industry level, at the manufacturing level, we also see a big net positive impact.
Great. Thank you all for the opening remarks. My question as a reporter is, in having covered this both from the energy side and the manufacturing side, you know, it seems like there are many benefits to this. Just today on this panel, we've heard it called a miracle. We've heard the current policy called nuts or crazy. The usual reasons cited for not lifting the ban is because, you know, refiners' margins might suffer, and, you know, there's discussion of whether gasoline prices might go up a little. Even so, we've got some very powerful industries on this panel: manufacturing, energy industry. What is keeping, and if as Boyden said, you know, this could be lifted, you know, by the president without, you know, Congress likely blocking it. Let me just ask the panelists, why has this ban not been lifted if it's, you know, been around for 40 years and other hydrocarbons are being exported? Is there anybody who...
I start off. I think the biggest question when we started bringing it up over the last 12, 18 months is everybody's concerned about the price of gasoline to the consumers. Most average consumers and most people don't know how gasoline is priced in this country. Through a series of studies, and you can just go on Bloomberg yourself and look at it yourself if you have access to it, but it's tied to the world market. It's closer related to Rotterdam and Singapore gasoline prices. And so if the refiners are paying us a discount, which they have been, as high as $30 a barrel, they are not passing that on to the consumer. So all the products here in the U.S., whether it's gasoline and other products, are priced off of a world market price. So these studies have shown that if we're allowed to export, let's say we start exporting 1 million barrels a day, for instance, of light sweet crude, that it'll put more pressure on OPEC. OPEC will have to decide, obviously, do they cut back 1 million barrels a day? Or does OPEC try to focus on market share? But in either scenario, you put another 1 million barrels a day on the market, it's going to soften world oil prices, which softens gasoline prices. So most of the studies are seeing about somewhere between 8 and 13 cents drop in U.S. gasoline prices if that happens.
But again, I mean, that's another reason to do this. If there are all these reasons that the panel cited, plus lower gasoline prices for consumers, then why isn't the president or Congress pushing for this?
Well, these outside studies have just finished. They just published, and the EIA is coming out with their series of studies over the next 3 months.
Okay. Boyden, you want to just address the political logjam on this?
Well, one is, of course, the refiners that are capturing this margin. They're buying inputs cheap and selling the outputs at the world price and pocketing the difference, and they have every incentive to keep the situation the same. And that's an interest group which is not lacking in power. They've got a lot of money and they know how to use it. Then there's the chemical industry led by Dow, which is not totally unrelated to the refining industry. Dow buys $30 billion a year in oil and gas. It's 50-50, 50% of its oil, 50% of its gas. But it's an input for them, and they see visions of sugar plums, of a renaissance of U.S. chemical manufacturing built on this arbitrage. And they're effective. The chemical industry is effective as a lobbying group. And then, of course, there's Senator Markey, who's not lacking in influence. He's reacting probably off the consumer side of this, which should change once people understand. But I think missing in a lot of this is a discussion of what this would do to Russia. Russia in a way, the Soviet Union was broken by the Saudi gusher at the request of Reagan in the mid-'80s when prices were cut from 25 down to 15 or something. Huge percentage reduction. And I'm told if the price got below 80 or at 80 or below, and there's some hurt would occur in this country because 80 is sort of a break-even point for a lot of economic drilling. But if the price got to that or below, Russia would be in real trouble, and that would make life easier for the whole transatlantic community. People don't talk about that very much. I don't know why it's not discussed. But Russia, if you look at, there was an article today which said, half their budget comes off of oil profits or something. So they're very vulnerable, much more vulnerable to these price flows than they are to sanctions.
Randy, let me just ask you in terms of, the manufacturers have some power in this town, as do oil companies. I feel skeptical that opposition from refiners or chemical companies alone could block this. I mean, your company has a market cap of about 12 billion, Pioneer's about 23 billion. There are big companies behind this. Why do you think this hasn't happened yet? If not only would it lower your gas prices, could actually keep Putin in check, which is something nobody's been able to do. It seems like
I won't weigh in on the geopolitical aspects.
But why hasn't it happened yet?
Inertia, right? I mean, it's been in place for 41 years. The analysis that Scott's talking about is new. It has to be assimilated. But I think it's inertia and then fear. But I mean, we don't regulate the margins, right, for bottled water.
Right.
Why would the government be concerned about margins in a refinery? We don't regulate them for Nike. They're a lot higher, by the way.
Do you think, given the way things are going, the likelihood is this ban will be lifted in the near future?
I don't live here, and I try to deal with the certainty I can deal with. And I think we'll do well if it's not listed, and we'll do even better if it was lifted. Because I think that will provide greater certainty. The world is very uncertain. If they could just lift that, and then we can have our oil priced at world markets. The industry is very adept at adjusting. The industry will adjust, and frankly, economics is a lot more understandable than public policy when it comes to trying to run a company. I do know that after 14 years. So
let me just follow up on that and ask you, as just bring it back to the manufacturing issues. We've talked a lot about the energy side of it. Manufacturing has gained about 700,000 jobs since the trough in 2010 following the recession. So manufacturers are doing better in this country, despite the idea that we don't make anything. We make as much as we ever did, but we do it
very productive industry, by the way.
We do it.
It's like saying we don't have any, we're not in farming because we don't have many farmers anymore.
We're doing it with fewer workers than we did decades ago. We're still making a lot of stuff, 700,000 more manufacturing employees. From your perspective in your company, I mean, do you foresee what Jeff was talking about in terms of the growth for manufacturing?
When Jeff and I were talking earlier, if anything, even though it's a doubling, I think the knock-on factor would be bigger. I mean, when I see what it's, just take the petrochem investments. That could be $500 million over time in valves and thermal, just for my company. That's a lot. That's a lot of business. And if that happens faster, I think the industry won't stop there. I think it will continue to grow. This is a very different world. I mean, what formed manufacturing, what forced a lot of jobs out of America and forced productivity wasn't just the rise of the strength of the Japanese. It was also an incredible change in our energy structure after first 73 and then in the early 80s, when our energy was unpredictable and our policies were unpredictable. A lot of jobs, like the petrochem industry. These industries are coming back. If we get this right, they'll stay. And this will be the new middle class. I mean, we can't all found Facebook, right? I mean, there's just not enough brain power to do that. And there's real virtue in these kind of middle class working jobs. We gotta rebuild that. They're there. They're there. Right. A lot of them right now you can't find. You can't find truck drivers. You can't find welders in some areas. We need more engineers. It's all really because of what's going on in manufacturing, and yes, in technology too. They need engineers, but they don't need many truck drivers to move windows around. Microsoft's Windows, Anderson Windows. They do need to move those, but you know, this can be it's going to be an entirely different phase for American growth. I believe that. That's why I came to the panel.
Great, thanks. One question, Scott, you mentioned prices going down as much as a dime or so on gasoline for consumers if this were to happen. One argument from the people who oppose it, and I talked to Senator Markey's staff about this, they make an argument that gasoline prices could actually go up, which I think politically is one reason this ban is still in place, because that scares a lot of politicians, the idea of gas prices going up. Why in particular are you not, as an oil industry guy, do you not see that as a problem? And what about that argument doesn't hold water for you in terms of the threat to consumers from this? Because it's clear it would be good for the energy industry.
I haven't seen any backup to their statements, first of all. I think we have backup. Like I said earlier, you can go on Bloomberg and see where the price of gasoline is priced worldwide. So anytime the U.S. If it continues to grow its production, it's got the capability. It's going to put in a weak. The world's economy is weak now. China is weaker. Europe is much weaker. Anytime you put more oil in the marketplace, it's going to pressure world prices. And so, to me, it's simple: supply demand. So I have not seen any. I can't comment because I haven't seen any backup as to their rationale. So
I would just add the other argument, along with the projected negative impact on consumers, is the sort of energy security argument and the energy independence argument, i.e., that by exporting crude, even though we currently export some natural gas, petroleum, by exporting crude, we'll be more vulnerable in terms of a supply shock along the lines of say, Libya went offline again or Iraq went offline, and that this could, right now, we have more oil than we know what to do with, but this could quickly turn. I'm kind of curious what Boyden thinks about the energy security argument as a reason not to lift the ban.
Well, I may not understand the economics of the industry. I'm not really the right person to ask this, but if you artificially depress the price by cutting off a source of demand, you may endanger the drilling because the price gets so low, people stop drilling. But this thing started, I think you pointed out, this thing started as a gas play. But it soon became apparent that it worked with oil, and oil commanded a higher price. So everything moved, not everything, but most of the rigs moved to oil. That didn't mean the gas was totally ignored, because a lot of gas gets discovered along with the oil. So the gas is there if we could pipeline it somehow. But I think the biggest risk is that by limiting the size of the market, you lower the price to the point where people say it's better to move the rigs to Mexico, or better to move the rigs to there, or better just to shut them down because we can't make it pay. And I think that would be a real catastrophe.
Along those lines, let me ask Scott, we've had a big drop in oil prices over the last few weeks. I realize we're talking about the longer term here, manufacturing jobs over 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I'm just kind of curious if, given the drop in crude prices last few weeks, if it keeps going down or it stabilizes in the 70, 80 range, does that affect this unconventional and shale play significantly?
Yes, that's a good question. We've lost about $20 plus in WTI and over 20 in Brent. And as Boyden says, the perception out there is that below $80, you'll have a significant change for WTI in capital budgets. Board meetings are meeting late this year, early next year, to decide on 15, 16 capital budgets going forward. It's much harder to shut down a horizontal rig program. Most people don't realize a horizontal rig, from the time you spud a well to the time you get first production, is 6 months. A vertical well, you get first production in 30 days. So it's easier to shut down vertical rigs, which we did in 2009. We were running 30 vertical rigs. We shut down to one as a company very quickly. We didn't know what the price of oil was going to be. Today, companies are in much stronger balance sheets, much stronger financial flexibility. One thing that's affected the industry is the lack of hedging. As I said, WTI is $11 long term, less than Brent. If Brent is $93 out in the out years, if WTI was $93 a barrel, I can promise you our industry would be out there hedging significantly for the next 2 or 3 years, and you would not see any decline. Even with this current decline down to the low 80s right now in WTI, the industry would drill through the cycle, would be the opinion. If it drops into the 70s, into the 60s, you will see a significant curtailment. You will see job loss, rig loss, starting with rigs, job loss. Going into the service companies will start reducing the number of employees. The E&P producers like Pioneer will start reducing the number of employees. If we thought it was going to drop to those levels, say in the 60s and 70s, and stay there long term. It depends on what the futures market is doing, the perception of the world economy, so we have to take all those factors. So those are all going through the boards at this time. Decisions in the OPEC meeting coming up, I've read it could be a disaster. If it happens, they have totally disagreement at the upcoming meeting, and also depends on what the Obama administration does with the Iranian negotiations 3 days before. So if Iran is led on and an agreement is reached, another 500,000 to 1 million barrels a day will come on the world's market right before the OPEC meeting. That'll put more pressure on world prices. It'll exaggerate the price. And boards will have to make quicker and quicker decisions. So,
I mean, those are shorter term factors. What's interesting is you're warning basically that lower oil prices might kind of, crimp this miracle that we've had in terms of tight oil production. What about the idea, though, but at the same time you mentioned if we did export more, that could put pressure on global oil prices as well. How do you kind of reconcile the idea that you want exports, but at the same time you don't want oil prices to drop too far because that removes the economic benefit of unconventional drilling?
I think our wells are economical at $70 in the Permian Basin. They're economical at $60. There still is going to be some drilling. You're not going to have 500. We're at a record high 560 rigs in the Permian Basin. It's got 15% of the world's rig count just out in West Texas. Midland, Odessa is going through the biggest boom in their history. Midland's the highest GDP in the U.S. today per capita. It's gone from 100,000 to 160,000 people. It's going up to 200,000 people. What will happen, the 560 rigs will drop down to 300 rigs. 300 is still much better than history. The U.S. is not going to be growing at 1.1 million barrels a day growth. It'll be growing at 300, 400,000 barrels of oil per day. So the industry will survive. But that scenario, it could happen by the Saudis dropping the price like they are now, or it could happen with these differential blowouts. All we're still asking is to get a fair price for our product and allow us to plan better long term to compete on the world market.
So it sounds like the industry will survive, but we're not sure about that North Dakota Symphony, whether they'll get off the ground.
Let me just interject that even if the worst case, it sounds a whole lot better than it did when 41 and Barbara first went to Midland and had to share a bathroom with a prostitute.
That's a picture.
I want to open the floor up in a couple of minutes to questions, but before I do that, I wanted to ask Randy, you mentioned that energy is really driving a lot of your growth. In terms of your products, how much of that new energy and incremental demand from the energy sector is domestic versus globally?
Well, a lot of it has been domestic, and actually a lot more than ever before. I mean, right now, across the whole country, about 43% of our sales are in the United States. All industries, not just oil and gas. And that was only 39, 38% 3 years ago, 4 years ago. The U.S. is growing, the rest of the world isn't. And right now China's not growing as fast as it was. Brazil's a disaster. And from a business standpoint, but demand there is not strong. Africa, we talked about earlier, we've had to stop sending some people to West Africa because of Ebola. And so there's a lot of things tamping down demand for energy right now that I think is actually going to correct. I'm an optimist. There's going to be 5 billion middle-class people in 20 years. There's only 2 billion today. There was a billion 15 years ago. Those middle class are going to live at a higher living standard. If they all live like Americans do, we got real issues. But they don't have to because of innovation, and they'll still live a better life, and that's the opportunities that the energy business will have. That's where the opportunity that the food industry, which is another great industry in the United States, will have. So we try to plan longer term about the businesses we choose to be in. As I mentioned, we focus on that nexus of food, water, and energy, and those 5 billion, maybe it won't be 25 years from now, maybe it'll be 30 years from now, but there's still going to be a huge market that needs to be served in some kind of a sustainable way. And that's the innovations that we focus on. So right now the U.S. is ahead of growth. That's not the bet. That's not the bet that we made 7 years ago. Right. In our strategy, we bet that the U.S. wasn't going to grow as fast. It's luckily we have been recovering. And I'll say it again. I think a lot of it is because of the energy revolution we're seeing. That's really helping our country right now.
Let me just, again, before we open the floor, Jeff, in terms of the study, I understand you're looking at the long term and intermediate term. I'm just kind of curious, if we do get lower oil prices for a while, does that, affect, how much does that affect the scenarios you outlined?
Well, oil prices are usually self-correcting in a sense. So if they become low, the supply elasticity might be quite high, and you get cutbacks on supply. If the economy is growing as it normally is, then the demand will go and the prices will come up. Same thing if prices spike. Prices get really high. I think this is the lesson of the last 20 years, is that the supply will come on board, either through technology or just people, more incentives to go look for it. So those, over the long term, the oil price tends to average out. Now, we kind of wish we all knew what that equilibrium price was, but if you're thinking, about $100 a barrel in real terms, that's kind of what people think about. So at 60, it could certainly happen, especially given the weakness around the world, but it wouldn't stay there for very long. So the long-term patterns would take over.
Great, thank you. Let me open the floor to questions. All I ask is that, as they say on Jeopardy, your statement be in the form of a question, not a statement. So that, and should keep the questions fairly brief so we can have as much time with the panelists as possible.
We have a roving microphone too.
Great, we have a roving microphone. This gentleman right over here, please.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this today. Very thoughtful panel. My name is Michael Maybach with the Aspen Institute. I'd like to ask about tax policy. Number one, we have the highest corporate rate in the world. Number two, we use worldwide rather than territorial, which is also unique. And number three, we do have certain gas and oil credits or set-asides. Would the manufacturers here favor, let's say, a 25% flat rate and territorial, or is there some other tax combination that would help the energy industry?
Well, as a manufacturer, having a similar tax system to all of our world competitors is a good idea. 25% and territorial would be what I would do. This notion that companies have this money overseas and that the government is going to ever see it is wrong. This money that's overseas is overseas legally, and it will be put to use overseas. It's ironic that Siemens can make money in the United States, bring it home, and invest in an apprenticeship program or a factory in Germany without it being taxed again. But an American company can't do that with the money they make in Germany.
Scott, any thoughts on the tax debate that he mentioned in terms of the energy industry?
As most of y'all know, we have the word's credit. It's not a credit, it's a tax deferral. We get to every well we drill, 70% of it is what we call intangible drilling costs we can't recover. So the pipe is cementing in the hole, we cannot recover that. And it's been around for over 50 years and allows the industry. Most wells, as you know, are not drilled by major oil companies anymore. They're drilled over 90% by U.S. independents that were very, very small, $1-2 billion independents now that are 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 billion dollar independents. And we overspend 100% of our cash flow. And so we're not big dividend payers. We reinvest back into the U.S. So we're not big buyers like the majors of their stock. We're not big dividend payers. The major oil companies distribute 50% of their cash flow out as dividends or buying back stock. Independents, we overspend. And it's because of that tax deferral, and eventually those taxes will be paid. So it goes in deferral on the balance sheet. Now, we don't mind as an industry if they lower. There's been some discussion as to whether or not if we lower the U.S. corporate tax rate to 25%, would the industry consider giving up some of those intangible drilling costs? Now, I think the industry would listen and probably consider something in that regard, as long as there is a balance that doesn't affect the significant cash flows coming from our industry.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Maybe over here, right in front. Yeah.
Hi, Jennifer Deloy with the Houston Chronicle. Short of the administration lifting the ban entirely or Congress doing so, I'm wondering if you think options under the current trade policy, whether it's processed condensate exports or swaps or exchanges, can forestall a tipping point where we exceed our refining capacity or further and further the manufacturing benefits we're talking about today.
I can start with that. So I didn't have a chance to talk about our classification that we received earlier this year. We're the first producer to be able to export oil, excluding what's happened in Alaska into Canada in 40 years in this country. We shipped out our first cargo to South Korea. Our second one went to Europe. Our third cargo went to Singapore, and several more cargoes are going to Japan. We were receiving $15 to $30 a barrel less in the U.S. market because of the refiners, as I stated, they do not want this very, very sweet stuff. And so they were discounting to the producers significantly. So we went to the Commerce Department. They agree with our classification that we are moving our condensate, which exists as a gas in the reservoir, through a distillation process, changing the form of it, and so it became exportable. My opinion is that the Commerce Department has several more applicants. I hope they come up with a general definition of condensate and do a blanket release of all condensate in the U.S. My opinion is it'll push back the problem maybe 1 to 1.5 years if we're allowed to export condensate as a start. In addition, I think swaps should be approved. Swaps with Mexico, for instance, they've been talking with Commerce about swaps with Mexico. It should be a simple process, and that would help the situation. Eventually, we need most of the oil is sweet. The Bakken is low 40s. The Permian Basin is low 40s. We eventually need that oil to be released also in the overall export ban.
Okay, great. Please, right in the back there, right.
Thank you for a terrific and very informative panel. I'm Kent Hughes at the Wilson Center. 2 questions. You mentioned the advantage that the chemical industry got out of the lower prices, but really its affected all of manufacturing and helped attract some foreign direct manufacturing related investment. Doesn't that lower energy cost help offset for most of manufacturing to some degree the impact of undervalued currencies? And second, might it make sense over the longer term to incentivize the construction of new refineries that could take advantage of the sweeter crude that you're producing so that we would export the higher value-added products rather than the raw material?
Let me, why don't you answer the first part in terms of the manufacturing, and maybe Scott could take on, even though I know you're an upstream guy, but take on the downstream refining question.
No, you're right in terms of, the petrochems are coming back because natural gas is the feedstock for most petrochemicals, the natural gas liquids, the ethane and propane, butane. So they're coming back, and then that's the feedstock for all kinds of products. whether it's tires or home goods or, I buy a lot in a lot of my biggest purchase is actually resins, plastics. It's cast iron, cast metals first, and then plastics. So it will improve our investments. And in terms of a lot of, there are both U.S. headquartered and non-U.S. headquartered companies that are investing in that in that $50 billion in petrochemical. A lot of it is European, because they're looking at their energy prices in Europe and saying, I have to move. So I think there is a benefit to come here, and they're seeing our structural advantage in energy cost as something that they're willing to invest big capital in utilizing.
Great. Scott, you want to just address the point about refining?
There's some investments now in condensate splitters that are being done. But the refining industry, as I said, they made this $85 billion investment to convert to heavies. And the uncertainty and the timing, there hasn't been a new refinery built in over 30 years in this country. And to go through the process for permitting and the process to build is going to take over 5 years from the time they start. We just don't see it. I mean, if we knew we were all going to get fair prices, we have no problems of adding more refineries and be able to participate in selling our products international, but we just don't think that scenario is going to happen because of the timing, the amount of cost. There's been estimates over $100 billion to reconvert them back, and so I just don't think that scenario is going to play out.
Great. More questions, please. Why don't we go back to you, sir?
I'll just speak loudly. I'm Kim Kaufman from the Bureau of Energy Management, Offshore Energy Management, Ocean Energy Management. My question is about refining margins and export of petroleum products. We became a net exporter of petroleum products recently. Twofold there. One, how much of that do you think might be due to the cost advantage that refiners have with the discounted light sweet oil that they can't use all of it, but they can blend it with heavier oil? And do you think that would be affected if we were to remove the ban on exporting petroleum?
Anybody?
We actually, in the model, the exports of petroleum products falls exactly for that. So there's some quantification of that in there. So certainly, we feel that crude oil exports would displace some of those products, but that's simply the free market working, because in a sense, that crude would be searching for its highest value use. And now it doesn't mean that our exports disappear by any chance, but on the margin, we lose some.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. More questions, please. Why don't you, right here in the front row. Right here.
No.
Yeah. Mike.
I'm Jim Lucier with Capital Alpha Partners. We've clearly seen world industries pay attention to the fact that electricity and gas prices may be anywhere from 2x to 4x times U.S. prices in Europe and in China. And I was going to ask first how you see, has this idea really permeated through to U.S. companies yet? Is the U.S. manufacturing community understanding the benefit they have here, and are they beginning to line up behind the exporting industries, the petroleum industry? But based on the question that was just asked, I'd also be interested in your thoughts on where the markets for exported crude would be. I think your condensate is used mostly for petrochemicals. If we started exporting heavier crude, what refiners in the world would be buying that?
Why don't we go in reverse order? Why don't you take the question in terms of who'll buy it, and maybe we address the manufacturing part in a moment.
I think Europe needs our sweet crude. Asia needs it. Places down in South America. One comment I didn't mention earlier in the previous question about exports, if it wasn't for the ability to export butane, gasoline, and propane right now, the prices would totally collapse. And so when you're exporting that much, we're producing so much. And ethane, what's interesting is that Enterprise is going to be exporting ethane for the first time out of this country in 2016. So our ethane production has grown from 700,000 barrels a day to 1.4 million barrels a day. That ethane is 22 cents a gallon. The rest of the world's using naphtha as a feed product for ethylene, propylene, and so on. So the rest of the world, India happens to be the first country to take ethane starting in 2016. So it's going to replace naphtha in several places across the world and help lower energy costs. So it's important that these products continue to be exported.
Great. Randy, I know you mentioned your number of U.S. manufacturing workers has gone up along with demand. I would just ask, are manufacturers, seeing this tremendous advantage? And I would just also add one thought to the question, which is, does Washington see the value of manufacturing at this point, given all of these price advantages in terms of energy?
Well, I do believe, I don't think manufacturing capital spending is rising as fast as we thought it would, but I think that's more general uncertainty around the economic recovery. I believe that there is good examples. Again, the petrochemical, at least half of the companies I know that, and we're actively bidding, these are U.S. companies that are making these bets and bringing their capex back here, but so are Chinese companies investing here and European companies investing here in that. And then, we've had enormous productivity in manufacturing. We're back to revenue equal to pre-downturn revenues for us, but we're not back to the same level of employment on the same basis, and that difference is productivity. We're disciples of lean enterprise, like a lot of the manufacturing industry is, and you create capacity. We put creativity before capital is our philosophy, and that has hold sway for a lot of industries. But right now, I think capital spending is increasing broadly in the industrial space in the U.S., and I hope that will sustain. In terms of how important it is, and I don't spend a lot of time in Washington. I spend more time with customers and with plants, but I hope so. I hope, because I do believe that these are the jobs that we want in America. They're manufacturing jobs.
Great. Please, right here in the front, and then maybe the gentleman behind. Yeah.
Thanks, Gary Huffbauer at the Peterson Institute. I've read about Boxer and Markey opposing, but I wonder whether they are leaders of a silent army of opposition in the Congress to, changing the law, reforming the law, or whether the main problem is the lethargy and opposition within the administration.
I know you mentioned the inertia factor, and just generally in Washington. Boyden, you want to address that in terms of the administration on this?
Well, I think the administration has the same political antenna as everybody else, and this notion that you're more likely to see a gasoline price drop than an increase by getting rid of these restrictions is just not yet accepted by the American public. I just don't think it's part of common day ordinary thinking. And so I think the White House is as worried about the upcoming elections as the people who are competing in those upcoming elections. And this is something which I think they think would backfire, because I don't think the American public's there yet, but I think it's going to be, these studies come out, a little more noise gets made about the benefits of, benefits diplomatically in Central Europe. There's a story, Jackson Deal had a story, columnist for the Washington Post 2 days ago, saying that Eastern Europe, you now hear more rhetoric about falling in line with what Putin wants. And I think right now the airwaves are so cluttered by Ebola and everything else and the elections that a lot of common sense information is not getting through. But I have no doubt that the New York Times will clarify all of this for us and that in the new year, the public will become educated about what I think what the market realities are.
As you mentioned, I can offer one small point of clarification. In my reporting, we've talked mostly about Markey and some Democrats being opposed to this. On the Republican side, there's opposition too, often from senators in heavy refining states, because there is opposition from both sides, and I think for obvious reasons, senators who have a lot of refining want to protect, those jobs and those industries, which I think is part of it too. So please, right, yeah.
Hi, David Ivanovich with Argus Media. Mr. Sheffield, you mentioned your condensate exports. Can you tell us how much you plan to export this year, and if the BIS were to give the blanket approval for condensate exports, how much do you think the industry would export overall?
We are producing about 70,000 barrels a day of gross condensate. We plan on exporting most of that by the end of 15. Right now, we're only exporting about 10 to 15,000 barrels a day. If the Eagle Ford is at 1.5 million barrels a day of production, about half of that is condensate. So that's probably your biggest play in the U.S. that has most condensate. There's very little condensate in the Bakken and in West Texas. So if they do open up all condensate, let's say above 50 degrees or higher, then I could see numbers, 500 to 700,000 barrels a day, fairly quickly, mostly moving to Europe and Asia.
Thank you. Other questions, please, right here in the front row.
Thank you. This is also a question on condensates, Mr. Sheffield. I'm Laura Lipton with Bloomberg. I was just wondering, do you expect to see any other license applicants get approval from the Commerce Department anytime soon? We're hearing that the White House may be slowing this process down, examining things a little more closely. Are you hearing that?
I don't know. I think Boyden is right. It's political right now until after the elections. To me, there's people right next door to us that have the exact same distillation units. They're running the same exact condensate through, and they're not being approved. And so questions have been sent out and to those applicants. I would hope that something happens after the election.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Last question.
Maybe last question right over here from. We got one more. Oh, we actually one more behind. Sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thanks. Tim Gardner at Reuters. Some of the panelists talk a little bit touch on Saudi Arabia and OPEC. But we had a story Sunday that some Saudi officials were in New York last week saying that they weren't looking for any cuts anytime soon, and that prices of around 80 could be okay for a year or two. And I just wondered how that changes the debate. I mean, just a couple of years ago, Saudi Arabia was stepping up when we were experiencing losses from Iran, but now it looks like Saudi is almost ready to, would be okay if U.S. producers started to make some of the cuts.
An easy calculation, every $10 off of 9 million barrels a day is $33 billion less revenue to the U.S. producers. So we'll be investing $33 billion less. And so you go through that, we'll be drilling 3,000 wells less. And it has a major impact on production. And so I think the Saudis, at this time, it'd be nice if the Iranians or somebody else would cut, but nobody anticipates that. So I read the article about, I guess it was at a PIRA conference here or in New York, and that may be the case. It's a question whether or not they want 80 Brent or 90 Brent. At 80 Brent, there's going to be significant impacts to OPEC countries, to Russia and other countries. So if it's at 80 Brent, our fear is we get a $10, $15 discount. We're at $65 crude. Then a lot of the plays are uneconomical into the 60s. You'll see a significant cutback. If it's $90 Brent and $80 WTI, say $10, then you'll see some cutback. You're not going to see this one. I think the 1.1 million barrels a day growth was growing to 1.2 to 1.3 million barrels a day over the next 2 or 3 years, because there's so much opportunity here in this country. And their intent may be to cut back some of that. But we're still going to grow, but it still doesn't give us, we still need that fair price to compete with Brent and the rest of the world. Versus going, if that discount gets too wide, I think Boyden said, or somebody, that we would go into Mexico. If we can go across the border and invest capital, and we're able to export that crude, why not all this capital go over to Mexico or up to Canada? If they can figure out a way to export out the East Coast and West Coast, which they will eventually. So it just gives us an unfair advantage.
Great. Don, did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
one quick question, Don Norman Maypie. Suppose we had a long-standing ban in place against the export of petroleum products. Do you think that we'd hear the same arguments being made against lifting that ban that we do against oil today?
Anybody, Woody, you want to take that one, or?
I think
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an obvious answer. It's called, you're going to see hundreds of thousands of jobs shut down, the industry totally out of work. You'll be laying off, thousands of employees, so it'd be a disaster.
Why don't we cut off exports of corn and wheat while we're at it?
Great. Well, I just want to thank our panelists, Scott, Boyden, Randy, Jeff. Thank you all, and I just want to thank Aspen and Mappy, and above all, for convenience, and above all, thank you for being such an attentive audience and great questions. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.